Welcome to Looking Past the Problem of Mental Health in Condos, brought to you by CCI-Toronto. Whether you are a condominium director, unit owner, or provider of the industry of services, we welcome you to tonight's presentation. You could have been anywhere in the world tonight, and you chose to be with us. Well, anywhere in the world from your home through the internet. We're really happy to have you, and we're looking forward to presenting for you here today, this unique presentation. My name is Mark Balla. I will be the moderator here tonight. I am a mediator and arbitrator, and I just like to quickly clarify that the capacity in which I am presenting here tonight is in my own personal capacity. My opinions are my own. I am not here to speak on behalf of the Condominium Authority Tribunal or the Condominium Authority of Ontario. Joining me tonight are Lindsay McNally, who is a team leader at Malvern Condominium Property Management, Deborah Howden, who is a condominium lawyer at Shibley Wrighton LLP, and Keely Duncan, who is a criminal defense lawyer with Duncan Defense Law. Her practice focuses on providing compassionate solutions to those with legal challenges attributable to mental health. Keely's insights are applicable to condominiums, and we're really lucky to have her here with us tonight. Keely also lives in a condo, so can relate to us in our world of CCI in that way as well. Before we begin, I have a few administrative matters that I need to just go through with you. The first is you should be able to see on your screen the ability to ask questions. We do welcome you to ask questions, and we will be fielding questions at the very end of the presentation, not during it. So please be patient with us. Let us get through our presentation, and then we will address the questions that you have for us. If we end up not having enough time to address all of your questions, I've already spoken to all of the speakers, and they're willing to be available to you afterwards to be able to make sure that no question is left unaddressed. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, navigate to the top right of your screen and you'll be able to have our technical support team help you out. A survey is going to follow the presentation. Please do say good things about us in that survey. We really do appreciate it. We have fragile egos, especially in this state of times with everything that's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. The session is going to also be recorded, and a recording of the session is going to be circulated to you for you to take a look at, along with the slide deck after the presentation. We'd like to give a special shout out to our sponsors, First Service Residential, who is a partner sponsor, and Duca Property Management, who is our virtual platinum sponsor for making tonight possible. Now, before we get started, what we'd like to ask each of you to do is to take a couple of minutes, get up if you're capable, run over to your kitchen, and grab some spoons. I'm not going to explain to you why, nor am I going to tell you how many spoons you should get. You can make that decision for yourself. I can assure you that we do recognize that during this pandemic, many of us are going through a lot more dishes at home than we usually do, and we promise that the spoon activities we're going to be using tonight will not create more dishes for you. Please now take a couple of minutes to go get some spoons. Okay, we're going to resume. Our focus here tonight is not to look at mental health as a problem or a nuisance that needs to be remedied. It's not to look at people with mental health issues as the enemy who we need to enforce against in our condominium corporations. We're trying to have a different spin and a different look on mental health in condominiums. And we'd like to start by sharing some statistics with you. 1 in 4 people worldwide are impacted by mental or neurological disorders sometime in their lifetime, according to the World Health Organization. Closer to home, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health notes that 1 in 2 Canadians will experience mental illness by the time they reach 20. If you consider how many residents there are in your condominium community, we are not talking about a handful of people. We're talking about a lot of people who are impacted by mental health. A recent study has circulated that found that half of Canadians are reporting increased mental health stresses as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. These challenges are really common and they're very real and they impact so many of us. I wanted to quickly share a personal story as we get started, which is this year for Bell Let's Talk Day, I contributed a post to a web hub that I manage called ADR Athletics, where I shared the story that 2 of my kids have diagnosed social anxiety conditions, are in therapy. I mentioned in the post how my kids' peers do not judge them negatively for being in therapy because it's fairly common in their school for other kids to be as well. I was really surprised at the reaction that I got, not just the number of people that responded to me to tell me that they liked the post, but the number of people who responded to say that they themselves or a loved one also had mental health issues surrounding anxiety and other challenges that they had to address. One thing I found that is if you let your guard down a little bit, what we find is many more of us are impacted than we have traditionally assumed. CCI has done its part to try to end stigma. A couple of years ago, we circulated a Twitter chat on the issue of mental health. We can circulate the link to you of that chat, which was recorded. Every Bell Let's Talk Day, we always try to put stuff out there. But the reality is that mental health challenges are not once a year. Mental health challenges are ongoing, and we all really need to do our part to understand what people are going through and how we can help and accommodate them in our communities. We're going to start off with Deb Howden talking to you about some myths about mental health. But before we go there, I'd like to first just remind you about the spoons. And we're going to start with our first spoon activity. If at any point during this pandemic you have not been sure what day of the week it is, please take one of your spoons and just put it aside. Not on the floor because you don't want to create any dishes, but just put it aside. I'm going to turn it over to Deb.
Thanks so much, Mark, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. In my capacity as a lawyer, I often have to deal with condominium residents with varying degrees of mental illness. Sometimes the illness is an anxiety disorder, sometimes it's OCD, sometimes it's addiction or a psychotic disorder. And it always strikes me that just when I think we're at a point in our community where we understand and accept mental illness, so think of the Bell Let's Talk initiative that Mark just referenced, it becomes clear to me that we're not quite there. And we know that we're not quite there because stigmatization of mental illness still exists to a large degree in our actions, in our language, and unfortunately in our thoughts. So you've heard people say, for example, well, that's psycho, meaning bad. And sometimes we don't realize that we have those biases, they're unconscious. So it's important to talk about the myths. And the first myth is that this could not happen to you. And this myth, as well as others, may seem so obviously untrue when you see it in black and white there on a slide. But many people unconsciously believe that they're immune from mental health illness because they're really tough, or they're A-type personalities, or because it doesn't run in their family, or for some other reason. And, I can tell you a story. Mark just told one for his family, but I have a personal story about a friend of mine, a real Arnold Schwarzenegger type. He owns his own business, very productive, assertive, take charge sort of guy. He could be in an action movie. And he's never had any mental health issues. And then all of a sudden, bam, just like that, he started to feel dread, panic, sweaty palms, and a sense of danger. And he couldn't take any telephone calls. He couldn't interact socially. He couldn't go to work. He developed a severe anxiety disorder. That was the diagnosis ultimately, and it was something he developed overnight. And it was debilitating, and it lasted for weeks. So you've probably already heard the statistic that 1 in 5 Canadians is going to experience a mental health problem or illness in any given year. And Mark just talked about the fact that the most recent Angus Reid poll said that a sampling of random Canadians said that half of them, their mental health had worsened during this pandemic, and 10% shockingly said that it worsened a lot. So if you do not experience mental health and wellness yourself, it's very likely that a family member, a friend, a coworker will experience those challenges because it really touches us all. The myth that people with mental illness are violent is something I see quite a lot of, and unfortunately, it's perpetuated in the media, particularly in film. In fact, horror films as a genre rely heavily on the violent behavior of people with mental health as a plot point. And you've probably noticed that. So, for example, if you've watched any of the Halloween films, the main character, Michael Myers, is shown committing violent acts at a very young age. And after being placed in a mental health facility, he breaks out and he begins terrorizing his hometown. And this portrayal of mental health has become a whole franchise for the Halloween series. And then my very own personal pick for the scariest film of all time is The Shining. I know a lot of you who are listening will agree with that. But for those of you who have not seen it, you know it begins with a seemingly healthy Jack Torrance and his family arriving at a hotel to act as caretakers for the winter. And Jack is a recovering alcoholic who, after a period of isolation, starts hallucinating and becoming more and more violent as the movie progresses. So the general consensus is that Jack is, in fact, a paranoid schizophrenic. But the reality is that people with mental illness are no more violent than people without mental illness. That's just true based on statistics. The myth that people do not recover from mental illness is generally unspoken, but it's a widely held belief. We certainly know that mental illness is treatable. And in my practice, I've seen people recover completely from certain types of mental illness, such as anxiety and depression, but it is typically a process to recover. And recovery involves treatment and social empowerment and support from peers and family members. And the support piece is something that you're going to hear as a theme throughout this presentation. And there are many different kinds of treatments and services and supports that can help. And I believe Keely is going to speak to some of those close to the end of the webinar. The myth that mental illness is just one type or is always severe is just that. It's a falsehood. The reality is, you are probably unaware of all the people in your condominium community who are living with mental illness. Mental health and wellness exists typically on a spectrum, and it is severe when it results in a functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits one or more, could be more, of major life activities, such as working and going to school and shopping and what have you. But again, many mental illnesses are not that severe in the sense that I've described. They may be severe for the person experiencing them, but in the sense that I've described, and people are quite functional, even if they are left undiagnosed or untreated. The next common misconception is that mental illness is used as a crutch. And there's no denying that mental health conditions are real. There's no denying that. And unfortunately, some people who experience mental illness may act in ways that are unexpected or that may seem strange to others. But people with mental illness are like any other person. They make poor decisions at times, or they may do something unexpected. But this can also be for reasons unrelated to their mental health condition. So jerks exist everywhere. You've got jerks who are suffering from mental health and issues and jerks who are not. So all of those myths, I'm sure, will have been obvious to you, but it was important to discuss them and to stop the stigmatization, which currently continues to abound. And the key thing to remember, as a cousin of mine used to say, is remember that when you generalize about people with mental illness, it is general lies. So the stereotyping really has to stop. I want to switch gears for a little bit and comment briefly now on why it's important to talk about mental illness in condominiums. One of those reasons is because mental illness can sometimes, but not always, sometimes, lead to compliance issues. And I'm talking about the possibility of noise violations, compulsive behavior, accusations against management or the board that are not founded in reality at times, that type of thing. And I hasten to add that all of these things can and do happen with people who do not have mental illness. So it's both communities. But when it is a person with a disability, you have to treat them differently because there are accommodation obligations. And I want to talk about three common forms of mental illness. One is anxiety. There are three main subsets. There's generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorders, agoraphobia, that's fear of being out socially in big crowds. And people with anxiety can be more sensitive to noise. They can have changes in sleep or eating patterns. They can have difficulty concentrating. And that can lead to irritability, avoiding social situations, and it can lead to, quite frankly, non-responsiveness. So ignoring your lien or compliance letters. Or it could lead to persistent behavior, such as calling you 8 times a day about the same thing. Paranoia, the non-schizophrenic branch of paranoia, is generally a distrust of others. So a few common symptoms would be excessive sensitivity to setbacks or negative situations, a tendency to bear grudges, or to be preoccupied with feelings of a conspiracy against them, that everybody's out to get them. And when dealing with persons with paranoia, it would be important to speak clearly and to offer clarification where necessary, because things can be misconstrued, and it's good to anticipate what the triggers are if you know what they are. Schizophrenic paranoia is a subtype of schizophrenia, and it involves delusions, either visual delusions or auditory hallucinations. And this was my example, actually, of Jack Torrance from The Shining. Although remember that violence is not a feature of this disability. I've had to deal with many residents with this condition, unfortunately, and they're sometimes convinced that management is breaking into their unit and stealing their peanut butter or replacing their shampoo without authority. Hoarding is the last one I want to talk about very briefly, because you're all going to be familiar with hoarding. The problem with hoarding, of course, is it can increase the risk of fire or vermin or infestation. And obviously that would compromise the living situation of persons in the adjacent units and possibly in the entire building. So all of these mental health conditions require accommodation under the Human Rights Code, and because they're disabilities. And when I say accommodation, I do not mean that they have to be tolerated. Sometimes we get those two words confused. We think accommodation means you tolerate it. No, what I mean is you have to work with the person in order to ensure that they have the necessary supports. There's that word again, supports, to comply with the condominium documents. And I've done an awful lot of talking now, so I may just hand this back to Mark unless we're onto the next slide.
Well, Deb, actually, while we said that we were going to wait questions until the very end, one did come in that I think might be timely, if you don't mind just addressing it very quickly, and it comes from Don. Thank you for the question, Don. The question is essentially, can you explain to us the difference in your mind between mental health and mental illness?
So mental health is just your health condition. My mental health currently is good. Mental illness is where you have compromised functioning, either in terms of your thoughts or in terms of your emotions. So, for example, we would call addiction issues. They can be mental health issues. So that's or mental illness issues. So that's the difference. Your mental health just is whether your health is good or bad. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a mental illness. Mental illness is where the functioning is not quite where you need it to be in order to get through, your daily life, or where it should be in order to feel whole as a person. So hopefully that's responsive.
That's helpful. Thank you very much, Deb. Before we move on to Keely, we're going to do another spoon activity. So if during the course of this pandemic, you've had your hair cut by someone who's not your usual stylist, please put a spoon aside. And I do see that we have both Les Chernovsky and Murray Johnson on the call, and I'm sorry you're going to have to hold your spoons for that one, fellows. Turning it over now to Keely, who's going to talk to us about mental health and the criminal justice system.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Mark. So there is a significant part of my practice that is representing people who deal with addiction issues and mental health issues. And unfortunately, usually the two of them go hand in hand. There are a lot of people in the criminal justice system who are suffering from mental health issues. And as Deb said, it's on a spectrum. It's a continuum. And if you're on the mild end of the continuum, then you can be functional without any sort of intervention. But the further you go along the continuum, closer to the more serious mental health issues and formal diagnoses, that's when you start needing some interventions for coping mechanisms. And that's really what the culture is now. It's not a cure. Nobody's focusing on curing mental health issues. It's focusing on coping and understanding. The further along that you go to the serious end of that spectrum, if you don't have any interventions to assist you in dealing with your mental health issues, that's when things start to break down for the individual. It leads to antisocial behavior. And antisocial behavior I use not in the colloquial term, but more in light of the fact that the person is unable to comply with society's expectations of how they're going to comport themselves in a peaceful society. So without accessing those interventionist methods and measures, many people turn to self-medicating, unfortunately, and that's where the addictions come in, whether it's alcohol or drugs or a combination of both, or even some other ways of coping in a non-constructive way. But unfortunately, those methods of coping tend to exacerbate the problem because it's only a short-term solution. And once the alcohol or the drugs wear off, then they're exactly where they were before. Now, people can get into contact with the criminal justice system in direct or indirect ways. Directly, for instance, there is a person with a schizophrenic diagnosis who's walking down the street, and the voices in her head, because she's not under the care of a doctor and medically treated, voices in her head tell her that the person approaching her is going to harm them, so they attack first. Then she would be charged with an assault charge. That's a direct cause of how somebody would be brought into the criminal justice system. Indirectly, for instance, if somebody suffers from anxiety or depression that's on the milder end of the spectrum, but it means that they're unable to be around people, agoraphobic. They can't hold down a job. They can't get on the bus to get to work in the morning, which means that they can't afford a roof over their head. They're on a housing list, but they've been on a housing list for years. So they don't have a roof over their head. So their only option is the shelter system. But there's so many people in the shelter system, they don't want to be in the shelter system. So one night during a particularly bad storm, they head to an abandoned property that they know. They hop the fence and they go inside so they can shelter somewhere quiet, away from people, and dry. And somebody sees them hop the fence and calls the police. And the police attend and then charge the person with unlawfully in a dwelling because they're not supposed to be there. There's a lot of different charges that are on the lower end of the criminal justice continuum that are prevalent when you're dealing with people with mental health issues. And those are the cause disturbances, the simple assaults, the utter threats, the theft unders, the mischief unders. And this was becoming such an issue that around 2000, the Ontario Court of Justice started creating dedicated courts to deal with this segment of the population, because the thought process behind those courts was that but for their mental health issue, they would not be here. So if we can address the underlying issue of their mental health, then we can divert them out of this criminal justice system, because settling them with a criminal record is not going to be productive. Putting them in jail for 3 days or 10 days or 30 days is not going to address any of the underlying issues. They would get out and it would be the same thing over and over again, what we call a revolving door. This allows the courts to kind of unclog the courts from the more serious matters. And not to say that people with mental health issues don't address or don't commit more serious crimes. But the idea and the thought process behind these courts is that it's necessary to try to help people who, quote unquote, don't belong in the criminal justice system. And the idea that there is that culture of understanding that's going to help people with mental health issues extends to an example that I want to give you, for instance, and I call it Chad versus Joe, who is my two figment people, the have and the have-nots. And it's a bit of an example as to how social location is determinative of how a person can cope with their various issues along wherever they place along that spectrum, and how connections can make a difference in their ability to navigate. So for instance, let me introduce you to Chad. Chad lives in a condo like I do. He wakes up in the morning to an alarm on his phone. He gets out of bed, he takes his medication. He goes to the fridge to cook breakfast from the groceries that he was able to have delivered yesterday from ordering online on his computer at home because he has internet. He gets a FaceTime call from his friend who is checking in with him, just seeing how he's doing. He has a good chat with his friend, but then has to let him go because he's got a Skype session set up with his psychiatrist. Psychiatrist wants to talk to Chad to see if the tweaking of his medication is working or if it's having any adverse side effects. After the chat, the psychiatrist recommends a new drug that might not cause so much nausea and lethargy. She emails a new prescription to the pharmacy. The pharmacy calls Chad to let him know the prescription is ready and that they are on their way to deliver it to the concierge in his building. Chad's phone alarm goes off again, and it's time to take his meds. In the afternoon, he logs into his Zoom meeting with his counselor and the other participants for a group therapy session. At the end of the day, when he's tired, he takes his meds for the third and final time of the day. He crawls into his nice, warm, dry bed, and he sets his alarm for the next day. And I want you to contrast that with Joe. Joe wakes up in the morning to a yell from the shelter staff saying they had to be out by 7:30. He reaches under his bed to get his bag full of his worldly belongings to find out that he hadn't secured it properly the night before and somebody had stolen it while he's been sleeping. But at least he kept his phone under his pillow and he still has that. So he leaves the shelter, he heads to the soup kitchen, and he stands in line with everybody else waiting for breakfast. Once he gets breakfast, he heads to the YMCA to shower because he can't shower anywhere else. He heads to the nearest McDonald's after his shower because they have free Wi-Fi and he can't afford any minutes for his phone until his ODSP comes in. He stands in line for the soup kitchen again for lunch and then to the closest community center to wait until he can head back to the shelter. He heads back to the shelter for 4:30 and stand in line there to ensure he gets a bed for the night because all the registrations are done and the beds are full by 6 p.m. So if he loses out on a bed, then he's sleeping on the street. So that example is just an illustration of how your social location and the things that you are able to have in your life as supports, and not just people, but also technology and housing and food. And those are really determinative of a person's ability to cope with their particular mental health issues. And unfortunately, during this pandemic, we're seeing an exacerbation of mental health issues and the ability of people to cope. Community centers are closed now. They've been turned into temporary shelters, which has added 1,396 beds to the shelter beds that are available to people in Toronto. And I apologize for anyone outside of the GTA. My practice is GTA centric, so that's where a lot of my experience comes from. The YMCAs are now closed. In terms of picking up ODSP at the end of the month, there's only 3 locations that are still open, which means that they are running buses to the 3 locations. So in order to get to the location to pick up your ODSP or to refill your card, you have to get on a bus with a bunch of other people to be taken to that location. And if you are trying to apply for housing or trying to apply for ODSP or social welfare or anything like that, you need to have identification. And if you don't have identification, the identification clinics, the ID clinics that assist you in making those applications, they're all closed now too. Just to give you an idea of some statistics, as of April 26th of this year, there are 6,879 people accessing shelter beds in Toronto on a daily basis. With respect to the housing situation, in 2019, there were 6,181 new or reactivated applications for assisted housing. There were 522 individuals that were placed in housing, leaving a waiting list in the amount of 102,049 people. And keep in mind that these places that are open are only open as long as there are no confirmed cases of COVID-19. As soon as there's one confirmed case, that location shuts down and nobody has access to that location until it's safe to reopen.
I'd love to jump in here and kind of take a moment to express the importance of what Keely's referring to as it relates to condominium corporations, but also sort of tie it back a little bit to Deb's initial sort of myth run through that she did. So I think what's really missing in a condominium environment as it relates to the discussion about mental health is thinking about the alternative. Many of us living in condominiums, owning condos, renting condos, having that roof over our head, we have a degree of privilege in our lives that not everybody in society has. And we should count ourselves as really lucky. And we should try to stop looking at mental health issues and behavior related to mental health as being an inconvenience or a major breach of a lifestyle in a condominium corporation. Tying that back into Deb's myths, it really brings me back to, it couldn't happen to me. But I think we've seen in the statistics that 1 in 4 people will be impacted by mental health issues at some point in their life worldwide. And it's all about circumstance. You could very well be in the same position as that person who is causing problems in your condominium corporation because of their mental health. And we really need to all work together to come up with those creative, compassionate solutions to prevent major compliance matters that may add so much cost to a person's life with legal letters and things like that, that they may lose their homes and become a Joe and live on the street. And we don't want that for anyone in our society.
Thank you, Lindsay. Before you continue on to give us some additional ideas, we just wanted to return to a quick spoon activity for those of you who have your spoons. During the course of this pandemic, if someone in your household baked this week, please put a spoon aside. Lindsay.
So I have to put aside one of my spoons, maybe all of my spoons, because I'm going to be honest that throughout this pandemic, when I've been in isolation at home with my family, I've baked something every day, sometimes more than one thing a day. And that's just one of the ways that I'm coping through the things that are going on. So I wanted to bring us to a simpler and maybe less difficult conversation about mental health in condos, not related to COVID-19, but something that happens every day in the world of condominium corporations. In most condo corporations, there are about 2 events each year that would put someone in a position where they may have to speak in public. Now, public speaking and anxiety about public speaking is probably one of the more commonly known fears. Almost everybody gets a little weak in the knees and butterflies in their stomach before they have to get up in front of a crowd. Especially in the larger condominium corporations, you can have hundreds of people in a room for an owner's meeting. And there's often 2 per year in most condos. The annual general meeting, and as well, there's usually a town hall or an information session of some kind to talk about budgets and other things that are happening in the community. So these can be really hard, both for owners and the people who are at the front of the room, your board members, your property managers, your auditors. The large groups are intimidating enough, but you also don't really know what the environment is going to be. It is a well-known fact that in many owners' meetings, people can act badly and they can yell and scream and point fingers about issues that could be minor, could be serious. They may warrant a difficult discussion, but they don't always warrant the actual behavior that happens. So one really simple way that can help manage the anxiety that's created by this is encouraging people attending those meetings to submit their questions in advance. So this can help the speakers or those running the meeting to be less anxious because they can prepare better. They know what questions are going to be asked in advance. They can pull the information. They don't need to be embarrassed because they're caught with their pants down and they didn't know the answer to a question that was asked. And it also gives them a little bit of an indicator about what kind of mood the room is going to be. If do we have a real challenge here that we're going to have to overcome, or are people generally happy, and just asking simple operational questions. It'll also help owners who are attending the meeting and have questions. So if you have a fear of public speaking, it can be really difficult to stand up in the crowd and ask your important questions, but it is important to ask questions when you're a condominium owner and protecting your investment. So if you're able to submit your questions in advance, you can confidently know that your question is going to be answered. You don't have to be embarrassed about asking a stupid question because they can be addressed anonymously. And it gives everybody the time to do things adequately in a way that reduces anxiety and stress. So Mark, I want to move on to story time now, if that's okay. And I want to bring those participating in the webinar tonight back to an article that I wrote last year in Condo Voice magazine. You'll find it in the spring 2019 issue of Condo Voice. And the title of the article is "It's All Too Easy to Call Them Crazy." And I think it's a really important message. It was important then and it remains important now. So, the first thing I want to talk about as it relates to that article is, as a society, I think we tend to be a little bit sloppy in our communications these days. Social media, the immediate nature of communication in the world makes us a little bit more flippant about the terminology that we use. And it's really, really easy to say things like, oh, that so-and-so came down to the management office and he's just crazy. And I think we need to take a second to think about that. Because if you were in that situation and you were having a challenge and you were acting in a way that someone didn't expect relating to that challenge, I don't think that it's fair to just dismissively call people crazy or whatever other word that you want to use. We can talk about challenges, we can be upfront about them, we can be honest about them, but we don't just want to revert to calling people crazy and dismissing their concerns and the things that may be important to them in their condominium corporation. But the story in this article is important because it talks about a way that a property manager that I know who works with me dealt with a resident that had some kind of disorder relating to paranoia. Now, I don't have access to their medical records, so I don't know specifically what the cause for concern with their mental health was, but I can tell you that this person was very, very paranoid. So they believed that there were cameras in the smoke detectors in the hallway, and they were constantly putting pieces of tape on the smoke detectors. They were unplugging batteries in the fire alarm equipment in their units because they believed that there were bugs or plants and that people were watching them so they could come in and harm them. The residents spent most of their time of their day standing in the doorway of their unit, watching through the peephole to see who was passing by their unit. They were that scared that someone was coming to do harm to them. And they struggled to leave the house. They had a very, very poor quality of life, but it was causing problems for the condominium corporation because we can't have people tampering with fire alarm equipment. The other challenge we had with this unit owner is that they didn't want people coming into the unit for any reason. And we know that it's important to have access to the units to carry out the affairs of the corporation. So this person was talking to the manager very, very often because she really believed that something was going on and people were out to get her. And the manager could have sent compliance letters telling them to stop putting tape on the fire alarm, could have escalated to legal action at the cost of the unit owner. From there, could have gone into the court system to force compliance. It could have gone a number of ways that would have been costly both for the condominium corporation and for the unit owner. But this manager didn't take that approach. What she did is she actually took a moment when the unit owner was contacting her and coming into her office to listen to the unit owner, right? To have a little compassion, to understand the things that were causing them challenges and why they were so scared of the things that were happening in the condominium corporation. So the manager built a relationship of trust with this person who probably wasn't able to trust a lot of people in their life. And a couple of things happened. So first of all, the property manager was able to make an agreement with the unit owner that it would be okay to access the unit as long as the property manager was present, because that relationship of trust was there. So it enabled the property manager to carry out the important business of the condominium corporation without disruption from the resident. She was also able to develop such a trusting relationship with the unit owner that she was able to sort of prompt the unit owner to get a little bit of help. She would say things like, you know, sometimes I feel scared too in my life. And when I feel this way, I talk to people that I trust and I talk to my doctor. And the unit owner, their condition improved. And although they still showed symptoms and had challenges in their life, they weren't putting tape over the smoke alarms anymore, and they weren't causing day-to-day issues in the operation of the condo. And I really applaud that manager for her efforts in making sure that she had a compassionate approach to dealing with this unit owner, because as I said, it could have gone a much different way.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. We actually have a number of questions that have come in about how to interact with people with mental health challenges. So I think that story was really timely. There is no way we're going to have the opportunity to answer every single question that's come in on that topic, but we do have a plan now for Deb to share some stories of accommodation. Before we go there, I just want to throw in a quick spoon activity. If during the course of this pandemic, you've streamed a show that you would not want anyone to know that you watched, please put a spoon aside. You don't have to tell us what the show is. Deb.
I just don't know, Mark, how I follow a spoon activity with Tiger King on it. So one of our clients has been dealing with a hoarder. And this was actually pre-COVID pandemic. But to springboard off of Lindsay's story about not going a court route, trying to interact in a way that avoids conflict and trying to be more understanding, there had been some early initiatives with this one particular owner to attempt to get them to clean up their unit. And so compliance letters had ultimately been sent because there was no resolution to the soft attempts. And there was no infestation, I have to say, with respect to this hoarding situation, but the potential was there. And then, bam, that pandemic hits. And this was really challenging because it was about a 5 on a hoarding clutter scale. And for those of you who know what a hoarding clutter scale is, it's a series of pictures that go from 1 to 9 with incremental clutter to the point where 9 is the worst case. It's absolutely to the rooftops. This unit was about a 5. What is seen as acceptable is something between typically a 3, maybe a 4, but it was 5 and it was getting there. So given the pandemic, the advice to management was that they not go in and inspect the unit because we wanted physical distancing measures. And yet we had this escalating hoarding situation that needed to be addressed. So management dealt with her daily by going step by step. Can you clean the fridge? Show us a picture. She did that. Can you clean the dishwasher? Show us a picture. She did that. And so just incrementally, bit by bit, management was able to talk her through the steps that she needed to go through to address some of the problem areas in her unit. And lo and behold, the unit got clean without the need for an application, without the need for any court process. And she's now agreed to regular inspections of the unit, so it is kept in a reasonable condition because the tendency to relapse, of course, is there. One thing I hasten to mention is that it is not part of the corporation's obligation, nor is it part of property management's role to provide mental health services, only to help support the disability by coming up with some ways in which compliance can be achieved in a manner which acknowledges the disability. So you don't have to be healthcare providers, you just have to sometimes offer support and be compassionate. So accommodation for hoarders may mean arranging for cleanup and sanitization services. It may mean working with mental health outreach workers on consent, of course, social workers or the psychiatrist, so that they can let you know if symptoms become unmanageable. So the moral of the story really is that accommodation is not one size fits all. You have to be flexible. You have to respond to individual needs, but of course, without sacrificing health and safety. And then the one other story I wanted to tell, and I've told it a number of times and I love it. It's a story from the States whereby there was a resident who, I believe he was suffering from schizophrenia as well. And one of the things that he did as part of his symptomology is he would open the window to his unit and yell out obscenities to passersby in the street at some consternation, of course, to the neighbors and to the residents of the building. And then the other thing he did is he had a baseball bat and he would go to town on the inside of his unit. So he would bash against the cupboards in the unit and create a real noise disturbance. And they had talked about requiring him to vacate the unit. Instead, what they did is they began to work with his mental health professionals. And they swapped out the wooden baseball bat for a Nerf baseball bat. And they, through some, again, this was all bylaw and code compliant, they sealed his window in the unit so that he wasn't able to shout out obscenities anymore. And, he could go to town inside his unit without causing any damage to the unit and without causing a noise disturbance for the other residents. So these are just stories of how flexibility, creativity can go a long way. And the key would really be to try and de-escalate these issues as early as possible, to attempt to locate somebody in the community who has resources, who can act as an ally. And then to be creative, to consider all accommodation options, of course, up to the point of undue hardship. There's no requirement to be unsafe or to do something that would put anybody in harm's way. But if you can be creative and accommodate, that's what you're looking for.
Thanks, Deb. We have a few comments of people who are basically agreeing with everything that you're saying, that there are resources out there, and property managers, for example, are not necessarily mental health experts, nor should they pretend to be. The important thing is to seek appropriate help when you need it. Attached to our PowerPoint that's going to be available to everybody, this will be referenced later on, but based on the comments, I just wanted to make the point now, are a series of slides of resources that we're not going to have time to go through tonight. They're going to be fairly boring if we did, but it's a lot of contact information that would be helpful for anybody out there who is looking to find some of the resources that exist out there that could be available to them to help with some of these issues. Before we move ahead, we have one more spoon activity. We do have some people who've said they've run out of spoons, and that's okay. We'll explain it all in the end. It's all part of the plan. But this one, during the course of the pandemic, if you have stayed in your pajamas all day, please put a spoon aside. Now, we're going to move on, and as we do, I just want to remind everybody of what day it is. Not Thursday, but April 30th, and perhaps most importantly, what tomorrow is. Tomorrow is May 1st. What happens on May 1st? Common expenses are due, rent comes due. Particularly during this pandemic, financial stress is certainly heightened. They reported that the Eaton Centre, for example, only received 20 to 25% of its rent from tenants for April, and all indications are these types of situations are only going to get worse before they get better. Lindsay.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm really happy to talk about this topic a little bit because most people won't know, but when I started working in condominium corporations, my main role was working in collections and collecting common expenses. And I can tell you that financial issues are hard for people at the best of times. Even if you're mentally completely well, you don't suffer from any mental health issues. an inability to pay your bills is extremely stressful, and it will create difficult feelings for an individual. And then when you're falling behind and you have to talk to people that you don't know about your financial concerns, it makes it even more difficult. So, the pandemic has made this extra challenging, especially where you hear all of the feel-good stories in the news talking about condominium corporations that are giving, maintenance fee holidays. And why can't my condominium corporation do that for me? Or why isn't my condominium corporation doing that? And I want to talk a second about the hard reality of common expense collections, although I'll do so very briefly because it's not the focus of this presentation. And then I just want to talk a little bit about empathy and compassion, and providing support to people who may be struggling financially as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. So here's the hard reality is, banks and other lending institutions that are putting out programs, backed by different government agencies, they're in the business of lending money, and they have the resources to do it. And the provincial and federal government have the resources to help provide financial support to individuals who are suffering from financial hardship during this time. Condominium corporations, unfortunately, are not. And condo corporations themselves have not been provided with any specific financial relief through any government program related to COVID-19. As a condominium unit owner, you are a member of the condominium corporation, your common expense fees pay for the day-to-day operation of the property, and they pay for the safe operation of the property. If you have the luxury of having security to accept your parcels as you online shop during this time, you're paying the salary of those individuals who are at the front desk. You're paying for your landscapers to come to prevent ticks and rats and other pests from coming in. You're paying to make sure that the condominium corporation can maintain fresh, safe air through your corridors and units. And so condo corporations need the financial backing of their owners in order to operate. COVID-19 does not change this. So, you need to collect the common expenses, but there may be some strategic ways that you can help people who have financial hardship. Things like making sure that the dollar value of their arrears doesn't fall into that 3-month threshold that would require a lien registration. So while you can't give them a complete holiday, you can defer a little bit of their payments, making sure that they have made enough of a payment to prevent the registration of a condominium lien. You can also educate yourself as a property manager about what resources are available to people and financial supports that are being offered through COVID-19, and maybe provide them with a little bit of guidance about where to look. Of course, not giving them advice that you're not qualified to give them, because that would be an ethical violation of your condominium management license. And if you really think that giving something like a maintenance fee holiday is the right option for your community, you need to consider, first of all, if the condominium corporation has a sufficient surplus to back that so that they can still meet their financial obligations on a month-to-month basis. And of course, you should get legal advice to make sure that you're not compromising your ability to collect common expenses in the future from individuals who may be taking advantage of a common expense holiday. But really, what's most important is if you are in a position where you have to take collection action against an individual unit owner, especially now with COVID-19, approach it with a little bit of empathy and compassion. You can expect that someone who is in arrears and is having a collection file advanced is going to be angry. They may act out. That is not related to their mental health. It may just be a response to the situation that that's put in front of them. Brings me back to the Chad versus Joe analogy, right? So, if someone becomes Joe and life is a lot harder and they may act a little bit differently. So be compassionate and make sure that you're patient with the way that these people are talking to you about their maintenance fees.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. We could have done an entire session on collections during COVID-19. I know just from my practice experience that usually during the holidays, collection measures can be really difficult for people to undertake. And when we're looking at something that goes on for far longer than the holiday season, it really increases the challenges. So I understand the advice there is to see what kind of creative solutions you can come up with, but to work with your legal service provider to make sure that you're doing it in a way that doesn't compromise the corporation. And that's very important. I'd like to quickly share that Brenda has pointed out that in addition to May 1st being when common expenses are due, it's also National Doctors Day. So we'd like to encourage everybody to take a minute out of their day tomorrow to show some appreciation for all of the doctors and all the great work that they do for us. Before we move ahead, I just wanted to do one more spoon activity for those of you who still have spoons. And that is, if you have taken part in a Zoom meeting at some point during this pandemic, whether it be for business purposes or personal reasons to catch up with family and the like, please put a spoon aside. We're now going to hear from Keely, who's going to talk to us about resources, connections, and emotional support animals.
Thanks, Mark. I am going to talk about that. I just wanted to give a particular example that I'm hoping might drive home or hit home with some people, because mental health illnesses are very difficult to comprehend for those of us that don't struggle with it. Imagine the last time you went to a movie. Imagine the last time you went to a horror movie and you watched a movie like Saw or Scream or Halloween or The Shining, anything like that. And imagine the sense of fear and dread and anxiety and nail biting, fingernails digging into your palms. Imagine that feeling. Now imagine what the person in that movie is going through, and imagine what they're feeling and their level of paranoia. That level of paranoia and anxiety and fear is sometimes what people with mental health issues are dealing with when they're paranoid. Going back to Lindsay's article in the Condo Voice about the person that was watching out of the peephole because they were so afraid that they were in danger. That fear is so real to them that even though nothing is happening on the outside, it's happening on the inside, and it is so very real to them, and they are so very scared. But as Mark said, and even with the things like Bell Let's Talk and what Deb was saying about the shift in the language, the culture of understanding and the culture of inclusion, we're slowly starting to shift in the right direction. I mean, we're not there yet, but we are getting there, and people are making some remarkable strides to be inclusive and to be understanding. And that's reflective in the criminal justice system as well. Around about the time that the mental health court started, there is a program called the Mobile Crisis Intervention Team that started. And so that was with the Toronto Police Service, namely in 51 Division. It started there, it's grown. But what happens is that there is a specially trained officer who is teamed up with a specially trained forensic psychiatrist, registered nurse, who has experience with dealing with mental health issues. And so what happens is that when the primary response unit, who responds to the 911 calls and the police calls, when they get a call that they are able to flag as potentially being one that has a mental health component to it, then they would dispatch that particular team so that they can deal with the crisis on scene and provide them with the particular supports that they might need without resorting to the laying of charges and handing off that responsibility to somebody else. Now, the program has been going for 20 years. There are MCIT teams in all of the divisions, or I should say all of the districts across the Greater Toronto area through the Toronto Police Services. They're teamed up with 6 of the Schedule I hospitals all over the city. Schedule I hospitals are the ones that have a dedicated and designated forensic psychiatry wing that deals specifically and has the resources to deal with people that are suffering from a mental health crisis. The problem is that the funding is not enough to keep this team operating 24/7, but they do manage to operate for the most part about 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. And funnily enough, the most frequent time for calls that are classified or can be classified as mental health fueled are Thursdays at 3 p.m. That is their highest call time. But if they're not able to get, if the police are in a position that they have to lay charges and they do get brought to court, you do have the mental health courts that are available to people that are facing criminal charges. And the mental health courts really have the most comprehensive, in relatively speaking, teams dealing that are specifically in place to put some networks of support in place for people. Elizabeth Fry and assists with bail and release plans, as does the Fred Victor organization. Fred Victor organization actually has embedded mental health workers in the courtroom and the courthouse so that they're able to meet with people who are either going for bail or in custody, or meeting with people that are out of custody and putting them in touch with the networks of support that they need in the community, and even going out and meeting with them in the community. And Soundtimes is a beautiful organization for people who have usually been in the position that the current accused people in the criminal justice system are facing. And they are the boots on the ground, help. They'll meet up with the accused person. They will walk them to their appointments. They will remind them of their appointments. They will provide that structure and that accountability that somebody, especially of no fixed address, doesn't have. And if somebody is dealing with a particularly bad mental health crisis, you have the code of safe beds and the safe bed registry that you can call up every day. And there's a limited amount of beds, but you can get them through, if you are able to secure a safe bed for somebody, you can get them in for 3 to 5 days or 5 to 8 days, sometimes depending on what the location is. That could roll over into a short-term residential stay for 30 days that would get them seen by a psychiatrist, get them possibly diagnosed, get them on steady medication. And if they are having such a psychotic crisis that they need intervention, and the thought process is that they are not fit to participate in the criminal justice system, which means that they really don't know what's going on, then the mental health courts liaise with CAMH, and they have a doctor that comes in every day to conduct fitness hearings in the afternoon. They secure beds in order for them to get to CAMH if they're found not fit, to get them on medication and give them that leg up. And so so there's a wealth of resources that are there. But getting back to the culture of understanding, you don't want somebody to get to the point where they have to access the criminal justice system, because I see, although there's a lot of good in my job and a lot of happy endings for a lot of people, it's not always the case that there's a happy ending. And sometimes it's really beneficial to the person. It's beneficial to Chad to make sure that he doesn't get arrested. Otherwise, the results could be disastrous. For example, Chad's having a mental health crisis. He is yelling inside. His neighbor comes over and bangs on the door. Chad opens the door. He becomes verbally abusive because he's in a state of crisis. He threatens to beat up the neighbor if the neighbor doesn't leave him alone. The neighbor calls the police because they have nobody else. They have no idea what else to do. And who do you call when you need help? You call the police. But the police are not referees. And if they arrive on a scene, not a mobile crisis unit, but if they arrive on the scene and they've got reasonable and probable grounds to believe that a criminal offense has been committed, then they are duty bound to lay a charge, which means as soon as neighbor says, Chad uttered a threat, Chad threatened to kill me or threatened to beat me up, the police have to lay an utter threats charge. At that point, Chad is under arrest. He either gets released on the spot, promised to appear, he gets released from the station for an officer in charge undertaking, or he gets held for a bail hearing, whether that happens that day or the following day, depends on when he's arrested, because the cutoff of the courts is 2:45 p.m. So if he's arrested at 3 o'clock, then he's waiting the next day. If he is released from either the station or the courthouse, I guarantee that there will be a condition on that bail that he has no contact, indirect or direct, with the complainant, the person that called the police, and he has gotten an order not to attend at that address, except once in the presence of a uniformed police officer to collect his belongings. And then Chad has to look for alternative housing, which means he either stays with family and friends, or he's got the financial resources to put himself up in a hotel, or he's got the financial resources to rent another apartment. And if none of those options are available to him, then Chad becomes Joe, and he's looking at exact same day that Joe has. Just going to the amount of criminal resources that are available to people with mental health. And again, I apologize that my resources are Toronto centric, but in one of the slides at the end is the website www.ementalhealth.ca. That is one of the most comprehensive sites that I have seen in terms of access. So you can filter by region or jurisdiction or city. You can filter by publicly funded or privately funded. You can filter by counseling, psychiatry, psychology. You can find exactly what you're looking for. And then when you've narrowed it down to exactly what you're looking for, there are options. So I would really encourage anybody that is struggling or looking for some resources to visit that site. Finally, in the spirit of inclusion, there has been a trend in the last 5 or 6 years in Toronto, in Ontario, to recognize that the criminal justice system, testifying in the criminal justice system in a trial or a preliminary inquiry, is in and of itself a stressful event. And so even though I represent the accused, there are other participants in the system. And for a witness to get up there, for a complainant to get up there who deals with anxiety or depression and has to testify against this person that did something against him or her allegedly, is going to be a stressful event for them. And so there's been this upsurge in the last 5 or 6 years for the inclusion of a testimonial aid, by the way, of a support dog, a support animal. Quite frankly, I myself have done a preliminary inquiry where the 16-year-old with a mental health level of about an 8-year-old had a support cat as she was testifying. So those are becoming more and more prevalent and acceptable as mental health is becoming more and more talked about.
Thank you, Keely. It's interesting that you say that, because in the post that I mentioned at the beginning of this, where I talked about my kids' social anxiety disorders, I actually reflected on how they would be as witnesses participating in the justice system as it is, and how difficult it is and stressful it is to be a witness. And my experience has been as an expert witness, not as somebody who's been emotionally tied to an outcome or a situation. So it certainly can be very stressful. Just wanted to add that Randy had mentioned in the course of the comments when you were speaking that York Region has a very similar system in terms of support, as you explained, for Toronto. And just to let everybody know that the chapter, the Toronto area chapter, we do have in the resource section of this slide links to information that you can get for various regions throughout. But we're looking at fairly similar types of strategies at this point throughout the GTA, is my understanding. Now, I don't want to try to add too much humor in something that's very serious and sobering, but we do want to continue on with our spoon activities. And one thing that we have is, during the course of this pandemic, if you've ever just reflected for a second to notice that there's no planes in the sky, please take a spoon aside. Deb's going to talk to us about animals.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to take a segue from what Keely just mentioned in terms of emotional support animals. I don't think you can really talk about mental health in condominiums without speaking about emotional support animals. And That's because it's a really big human rights and mental health topic right now. There's been a steady rise in the use of service animals. That is also true for the COVID pandemic period. And of course, not just in the condominium industry, but in all housing and service sector over the years. Some of you may have seen, the recent CBC report a few months back talking about emotional support animals on commercial flights. And there was a huge article and a documentary on that. But I don't want to go too far afield because I see that our time is running short. So maybe what I'll do is I'll use my time now, Mark, just to talk about three things that I find come up fairly regularly in the context of emotional support animals. And the first issue is undue hardship. And what I hear a lot is, well, first of all, if somebody who's requesting an emotional support animal knew that there was a rule against the animal or there was some prohibition against the animal in the condominium documents, that should be undue hardship. And to the extent that the rest of the owners or residents don't wish to have the emotional support animal in their community, that should also play into undue hardship and, this type of thing. That is not a consideration that the Human Rights Tribunal will acknowledge. There are only three considerations they will look at. It's cost, outside sources of funding, and health and safety. So if your emotional support animal is a Rottweiler and he's vicious, then there might be an undue hardship piece there for accommodation. And I mention a Rottweiler because currently in front of the Human Rights Tribunal, there is a case, a librarian who has a medical note to say that she must bring her Rottweiler with her to work and stay right with her as she works in the library. So that's a case that's currently at the tribunal. We're very interested to see whether or not that's going to settle or whether that's going to go to a full hearing. But the point is this: undue hardship is a very stringent test with the tribunal, and the preferences of the other owners in the community is not going to be relevant. The other thing that I like to mention, and that many people don't realize, is if you can accommodate the disability with an alternative, even if it's not the accommodation that the person with a disability would like, then that is permitted under human rights legislation. So, for example, if your condominium community has a rule against dogs over 25 pounds, and the person requesting accommodation does not have the dog yet, if they have an animal, then it's likely they would have bonded, and there are some additional considerations there. But if they have not yet gone out to get an emotional support animal and they're just asking for permission to bring the animal in, then again, going back to my example, it would be unreasonable for them to go out and get a vicious Rottweiler when they could comply with the condominium documents. So that's just very generally. And then the last thing that I get asked a lot in the context of emotional support animals is, don't we get to see, after a certain amount of case law that's been out there, don't we get to see medical notes, and don't we get to ask for a diagnosis? And the answer is yes, you do get to see medical notes to a certain degree. Can you ask for a diagnosis? Not necessarily, and frequently no. You can ask about what the restrictions are, you can ask about what the accommodations are required, but you don't typically get a diagnosis on what the actual mental health illness is. So I'm hoping that is helpful on some level. Mark?
Thanks, Deb. You actually have a number of questions, and I think very similar to the collection with COVID-19 that could be a separate seminar unto itself. Support animals could be as well. And while, Michelle, I acknowledge your question, a few others, we're likely not going to be able to get to all of the questions today, but we will make efforts to answer your questions after the presentation. While on the topic of animals, we just wanted to take a quick switch from support animals to pets and acknowledge that it has been widely reported in the news that there has been a staggering increase in the number of pet adoptions during this pandemic. A number of people are looking to pets as they have more time at home, as they're living in isolation, as a way to cope a little bit better with COVID-19. I promise the time has come for the very last spoon activity. For those of you who have spoons left, if you feel that your life is dependent on having an internet connection these days, please put a spoon aside. We're now going to turn it back to Deb to talk specifically about COVID-19 and mental health.
You know, this seminar is so timely because we cannot overlook the fear and anxiety that this pandemic has engendered in so many people. There was a 2004 study completed after SARS that looked at the mental health of people in Toronto who were actually forced to quarantine during that time. And it found that self-isolation could be associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, experts are now telling us that the COVID-19 pandemic is far worse and a lot more stressful for many people than SARS ever was, because SARS seemed to fade out a lot faster than COVID-19. So this is a very difficult time for everybody, but particularly for people with anxiety disorders. And the day-to-day activities that they might otherwise use to cope with the mental health condition may be more difficult to access. So for example, in your building, amenities may well be closed. So they can't go and get a good workout at the gym. They can't go and socialize in the pool. Some of these things would have been outlets. And by the same token, we have bad habits that are more readily available. I think Keely mentioned just earlier, access to alcohol and drugs. The inability to be with others physically can take away a spoon. And unless you know about spoon theory, you'll not know what that means just yet, but I'm going to explain that at the end of our session, I promise. So just to close off my comments here, this is a great time, an excellent time, to make sure that the people who are isolated in your building, in your condominium community, are taken care of. They may not have access to the supports that they once had. So reach out to more vulnerable individuals when you can virtually. So rather than just calling, if you can use Skype or FaceTime or a Zoom call, actually reaching out at this time is not only good for people who are struggling with mental health wellness, but also for people who are just isolated. It will make an important difference for them, and it will be preventative, and that in turn means less calls to a law office.
Thanks, Deb. I just wanted to acknowledge we have a comment from Dawn about just the impact of the news on people's mental health these days. One thing I've been recommending to people on their social media feeds is to subscribe to a few lighthearted accounts as well, like comics, Garfield, Calvin and Hobbes, just to have something in your newsfeed that's not going to just scare you and worry you, and also to limit how much you spend time looking at things that are going to bother you in that way. Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Mark. So I wanted to take a second to really try to connect everything that we've been talking about here this evening. And Deb's going to do the big reveal about our spoon exercise in a moment. And so I don't want to take away from the importance of that. But what I really want to do is ask our participants to consider, are you really being inclusive in your community? Given that most likely, a large number of those participating in tonight's webinar have or will experience some challenges with their mental health at some point in their life. Are you really being inclusive to those in your community who are already experiencing challenges? If you have a social committee, can people really access the social functions that you're throwing? Are they too large for some people who may have anxiety or agoraphobia, fear of being in crowds? If you think about Chads versus Joes, if you use social media and other electronic platforms exclusively to communicate in your condominium corporation, can everyone really access the things that you're doing? And are you using the right language? Are you communicating in a way that people with different capacities who are differently abled are able to digest what you're saying to them? Can they process the important information about their condominium corporation and their investment? And so I would really encourage everyone, just as they're steering the ship in their condo, to really think about these things on a regular basis, and make sure that they're on your mind, so that everyone living in your community has the same level of access to the community supports that you're providing.
Thanks, Lindsay. We're nearing the end of the presentation. Deb's going to give the big reveal on why we did the spoon activity, and then we're going to try to get to some of the questions. There are an awful lot of them. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll do my best to get to as many as we can. Deb.
Well, in light of all the questions, I'll try to be as brief as I can in terms of spoon theory. So spoon theory is about 17 years old. Some of you participating this evening may have heard of it. It was developed by a woman by the name of Christine Miserandino. And for anybody who knows how to pronounce that, and if I botched it up, I apologize. But she developed this in 2003, and Christine had lupus. And she was out in a cafe with her friend, and she was struggling to explain to her friend what it was like living with a disability. Now, she used it in the context of lupus, but it's used in the context of mental illness as well. And she was frustrated trying to convey what it's like to have this disability. And she grabbed a whole bunch of spoons from the table. And she may have grabbed some from another table as well. And she said, it goes like this. At the beginning of the day, I have a limited number of spoons. Each spoon representing the amount of energy that I'm going to need in order to deal with a stressful event, or complete an activity, or to do one particular thing. And once I'm out of spoons, that's it. I'm done for the day. I can't have any more stress. I can't deal with any more activities. I can't participate anymore. So spoon theory was developed as a metaphor for the amount of energy that someone has to get through the day given their disability or mental illness. And healthy individuals have an unlimited number of spoons. People who suffer from mental illness have a finite number of spoons. Activities take away spoons. Stress takes away spoons. Anxiety takes away spoons. So at the end of the day, if you're out of spoons, if you're out of energy, you can't finish all the tasks you want and you crash. So how many participants do we have in this webinar who have crashed? If you ran out of spoons when Mark was prompting you for the exercises, you have crashed, which means you're out of energy and you have to start fresh tomorrow. Your day is done. You haven't been able to complete the tasks. So it's a little exercise that helps us better understand the challenges faced by so many people in our community. I could go on, Mark, but I think that in light of the questions and the time, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Deb. We have approximately 5 minutes left. So rather than speaking to each individual question, what I'm going to attempt to do is generalize them. I've seen a number of questions that have come in speaking about people who don't look at condominium communities as a home, but as a workplace. And whether it be a security guard, a cleaning person, an on-site property manager, a service provider who goes to condominium communities and encounters people with mental health challenges. They, as we've already talked about, they're not mental health experts the majority of the time. They understand that we're pointing them to some resources, but they're really wondering that the general questions have been, how do we address people who have mental health issues? I know we've shared a number of stories of accommodation of some creative ways. And how can those on-site people who work in condos acquire some skills to figure out how to better address these situations? Lindsay, I think you perhaps have some experience and some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I actually think that it's probably simpler than most people believe. So when we talk about mental health, obviously there's a whole spectrum of different types of disorders, and there'll be people who are differently abled. But the vast majority of people who suffer from mental health concerns suffer in a more minor way. They're not creating a lot of challenges in the condominium corporation. They may be anxious, they may have other symptoms, but there's not the outburst. So those are the exception and not the norm. And so if you notice that someone in your condominium community is suffering from mental health challenges, or someone acknowledges to you that they're suffering from some mental health challenges and that's creating a problem in the community, a really good place to start is simply to ask, how can I help? Right? And then listen to that individual, and understand the position that they're coming from, and try to work through it with them, because accommodation is not just about slapping a solution onto a problem. Accommodation is about coming up with a solution that protects the condominium corporation and all the other residents, but also helps to preserve the dignity and independence of the person who is suffering from these challenges. And so making them a part of the conversation and asking the question about how they can be helped is a really good place to start.
Thank you for that. I have seen some condominium corporations, as they register residents, asking for contact information of an emergency contact or another family member who's not necessarily living in the condo. And I've seen some condos reach out to some of those people if there are issues, to try to bring family members or support people on board to help address any type of issue. Deb, there's a number of questions about emotional support animals, and I know we're not going to have time to go into it all. They're asking for case law as well. I do believe that you had a case listed in your slide, if I'm not mistaken. Do you want to just mention the case, so we can circulate a link or something afterwards?
We can certainly circulate a link. I removed that case because it was a case out of BC and it was very, very long, and I was concerned about the time it would take to go through it. But we can certainly circulate that case. This is a developing area of the law, in that we know that we have to accommodate persons with disabilities under Section 10 of the Human Rights Code. We know that. What we don't know, and I blame the conflict right now between the courts and the tribunal. The courts seem to have a different test for accommodation than the tribunal has. So when we're advising clients, we say, well, we really have to think about, are we going to be in front of the courts, or are we going to be in front of an arbitrator, or are we going to be in front of the tribunal? Because it seems to be a little bit of a difference in approach. The tribunal tends to be a little bit more dogmatic about undue hardship tests and accommodation obligations. So we need to see, this is an area of the law that we need to see more tribunal decisions on, and that's why I mentioned the library case with the Rottweiler. We need to see more court cases on emotional support animals.
Great. Thanks, Deb. So we'll certainly follow that up as new cases come out. CCI is always actively circulating legislative news flashes, case law. Condo Voice, we have a regular column of cases that have come out, and we'll certainly be sure to include future ones surrounding support animals and be able to get that information for you. The one question that stuck out for me that I thought would be a good place to conclude, I was going to ask each of you to answer it in your own way, but I just wanted to mention to everybody out there that originally, when we scheduled this presentation, it was expected to be a dinner and an in-person talk at Novotel North York. We had not yet had the pandemic touch down on this continent. And over the course of our planning and over the course of circumstances, we decided to present it as a webinar instead. We thought the subject matter was quite timely in light of everything that's going on with the pandemic. And we wanted to do something to give you something to think about specifically for your condominiums at this time. We were happy to have 54 people participate here today, a flood of comments, a flood of questions. But I'd just like to ask each of our speakers to finish by answering this question from Corinne. How does one stay positive in such bleak times?
I'll jump in and start. I'm never afraid to be the first one talking in a room. So, the pandemic is really, really challenging for everyone. And sometimes myself as a person, I feel a little bit guilty about the struggles that I'm going through related to the pandemic, because I am lucky to live in a home where I have, love from my family, and we have food in our bellies and a roof over our head. But the fear and anxiety of the things that are happening in the world, I'm not exempt from them, despite the fact that I have, a warm, loving home. I'm guilty of being somewhat cliche as it relates to my coping mechanisms and my positivity. So I bake pretty much every day. I'm home exercising. I'm planting seeds for my garden. And about a week ago, I stopped watching the news altogether. I figure that my friends will tell me if something really important happens. And in the meantime, I needed to get away from the doom and gloom that was happening on the news all day, every day, politicians speaking at the same time every day, taking up everybody's life. So I would say, Mark, I think you glossed on it a little bit, but do what you can to stay away from the negative news and focus on things that are positive and occupy your mind in a different way.
So just to springboard on that thought, what I jotted down when you asked the question was focus on the positive things in your life. I've taken a few mindfulness seminars, mental health mindfulness, and one of the themes that continually recurs is being grateful for good things in your life. And they can be very, very small things. I remember one particular seminar session that I went through. They encouraged people to wake up in the morning and create a small list of 3 things for which they were grateful, and to continue that on a daily basis. And they found that over time, mental health really improved. And they could be very, very small things. The sun is shining. The birds are chirping. I listen to my favorite sonata piece. Just very small things. But if you're mindful of those very small things which bring joy and happiness into your life, it can create a shift to focusing on good and knowing that while we're dealing with this pandemic now, at some point things will improve.
Thanks, Deb. Keely, do you have any final thoughts?
I have a couple. I agree with what Lindsay and Deb said. Absolutely. I think focusing on the things that we should be grateful for is something that you've got to have in your life. I think my experience with COVID-19 has been a little bit different from most people because for several reasons. One, courts got canceled for 10 weeks. And I, quite frankly, don't remember the last time I had 10 weeks off in a row. I was saying at the beginning that this is the perfect opportunity to go backpacking around Europe like I've always wanted to do. And that's not going to happen. But also you can't stop the criminal justice system. So we had to figure out a way how to adapt and switch to audio and video. And I was part of the team at one of the Toronto courthouses that was facilitating that. So I was incredibly inundated with trying to do that and communicate with the members and even just deal with my own clients because the Crowns were taking a second look to whether or not people can be released. So they weren't in the institutions in case COVID-19 broke out. And so then all of a sudden, my trials are canceled, but I've got, 20 or 30 bail hearings that I'm trying to prep at the same time. And then my husband and I were going through a renovation at the same time. And so I was trying to do that as well. So my experience has been really different, but I find what has kept me positive in this is that when court went down, and maybe this is the lawyer in me, Deb, tell me if I'm wrong. When court went down for 10 weeks, I went to my whiteboard and I'm like, here are the things that have always taken a backseat on my list for years. They always got bumped off the top of my list. They're always there as a reminder I need to do that, whether it's filing my taxes or filing my paperwork or cleaning my fridge, So I made a list of all of the things that I've wanted to do forever. And I'm getting to that list. So as I knock something off, it doesn't make everything in the world better, but it's one less thing I have to worry about when it comes time to worry about other things. And for me, that's how I stay positive.
Thanks for that. I'm going to share mine. I have just 3 quick things. The first is for those of you who know me know that I'm a big fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Toronto Raptors. And this time every year, they're usually, hopefully, in the playoffs. And a lot of times, more so than the Leafs and the Raptors, it's been disappointing. But one thing that's been great is these various sports channels have been replaying old games. I was recently watching the Leafs succeed in 1993. They didn't quite win the cup, but I don't have to worry about that spoiler yet. It's just nice to see them win a game. Try to enjoy the little things in life. One of the things I saw on the news is apparently there's, and I'm not an expert in this, but apparently there's a connection between exercise and good mental health. They recommend that 20 minutes a day, 3 times a week, where you get yourself a little bit breathless, can actually be really good for you psychologically. So that's one thing I've tried to do. And the final piece is I try to enjoy the little things in life. One thing that my family has done is we started getting groceries for my in-laws, and we've come to the realization that my father-in-law consumes an absurd amount of ice cream, like 3 of those giant Chapman tubs a week. So I just try to share that with everybody and get a smile on people's faces, and just try to enjoy those little things, because we can't control so much of this, but why not take the time and just try to enjoy some of the little things of the things that we can control and we do observe. It doesn't always have to be so serious. It doesn't always have to be so scary. We have enough of that going on. Let's try to find some things that are positive. That's it for tonight. We thank you very much for tuning in. I'd like to give special thanks again to our sponsors, to our producer, Terry Scott, to the administrator who helped put this all together, Kimberly Nash, and especially to our speakers, Deb, Keely, Lindsay. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Good night.